Hello, thank you all for listening in today. My name is Kathy Brown, and I'm with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Materials Management Program. I work in DEQ's Western Region, Eugene office. In this presentation, DEQ will share information on the funding authorization process and show you how to complete the Funding Authorization Form for local governments. This is one aspect coming from the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, or the RMA. Please note this presentation was recorded in November 2024 prior to completion of the second RMA rulemaking. Few other things to mention before we get started. You probably know at least one DEQ staff person in your wayshed who you've worked with on opportunity recycle reporting or has sent you updates on the RMA and its impact on local government recycling programs. I'm excited to share that at DEQ we have new staff working specifically on the RMA implementation in our regions. Our new team members will provide technical assistance to local governments on the funding authorization process and other questions related to the RMA in the coming months. I'm happy to introduce these RMA technical assistants, or RMA TAs, in this video presentation. First, let's meet my counterpart in DEQ's Western Region, Talisha Hickson.
Hello, my name is Talisha Hickson, and I work in DEQ's Salem office as an RMA TA. Today I will share with you a quick overview of what the RMA is and how it will work. If you want a refresher on opportunity to recycle changes or more details on how the RMA will affect your local government's recycling program requirements, you can watch a video from June put together by DEQ's regional specialists. That video, along with other resources on the RMA, is posted on our website. Our focus in this presentation is the funding authorization process, including the different funding mechanisms for local governments. This process will allow local governments to designate and authorize their service providers or other entities to receive funding from the Producer Responsibility Organization, or PRO, on a local government's behalf. We are going to remind you of other aspects of the RMA affecting local governments, including roles and responsibilities, recycling acceptance lists, the Needs Assessment Survey, Education and Outreach, and commingled recycling processing facility standards. You can find more local government resources on DEQ's website through the link at the bottom of this slide. First, let's do a quick overview of the RMA and how it will work. The RMA introduces a shared responsibility approach to Oregon's recycling system. Producers of certain materials will now share the responsibility with local governments, ratepayers, and customers to help manage our recyclable materials here in Oregon. This is how our new recycling system will work. Producers of covered products, which include packaging, printing, and writing paper, and food serviceware, will join and pay fees to a Producer Responsibility Organization, or PRO. The PRO will help fund their obligated responsibilities to make Oregon's recycling systems more convenient, accessible, and resilient. Just to note, the prospective PRO in Oregon is Circular Action Alliance. If you are contacted by Circular Action Alliance, we encourage you to engage in discussion with them, as they are working closely with DEQ, local governments, and service providers to make investments to improve Oregon's recycling system. Next, DEQ has established new statewide recycling acceptance lists. These lists will help make recycling programs more consistent across the state with the intent of making recycling easier, clearer, and more equitable. We will talk about those lists in more detail later in the presentation. Also, as some of you may be aware, DEQ performed the first statewide needs assessment survey in 2023, which allowed local governments to indicate if they were interested in receiving PRO funding to expand recycling services in their jurisdiction. DEQ is required to periodically conduct needs assessment surveys, so if you missed the first one, you will have a chance to participate in the future. As for education, the PRO will be creating new media and educational resources that local governments will use to promote the new statewide collection list or household and business contamination reduction efforts. Lastly, DEQ will permit or certify commingled recycling processing facilities that sort our recyclables, creating new performance standards and worker benefits. There will be new performance standards for sorting quality, managing contamination, and reporting on the destination of materials. Workers at CRPFs will also be paid a living wage with supportive benefits. These improvements will be supported by the PRO through two fees. One fee offsets the costs of removing contaminants, while the other offsets operating costs and absorbs recycling commodity market volatility. That was a quick overview of how the RMA will work, and now my colleague Rachel Van Wert will tell you about funding opportunities through the RMA.
Thank you, Talisha. Hello, my name is Rachel Van Wert, and I work in the DEQ's Eastern Region as an RMA TA. I'm going to tell you about types of funding available for local governments from the PRO. The details of PRO funding, eligible cost, and reimbursement are located in ORS 459A.890, but I will be summarizing them for you here. There are 5 categories of funding for local governments to help with the costs associated with RMA implementation. These are for transportation costs, contamination evaluation, contamination reduction programming, and recycling service expansion, which is identified in the Local Government Needs Assessment Survey and cost associated with post-consumer content containers. I will explain each of these in more detail. First, let's talk about eligible funding reimbursement of transportation cost. Local governments are eligible for funding of the cost to transport covered products more than 50 miles from a recycling depot or recycling reload facility to the nearest commingled recycling processing facility or a responsible end market. Details of the transportation reimbursement calculation are in the draft program plan from Circular Action Alliance located in the DEQ's website. Second, the PRO will provide funding or reimbursement for the costs associated with doing the contamination evaluation of collected recyclable materials required by local governments. If the evaluation occurs at a location other than a commingled recycling processing facility. Third, the cost of the contamination reduction programming for residential and commercial customers will be paid as required by ORS 459A.99. The PRO shall provide advance funding or reimbursement of $3 per capita per year. To note, all local governments, regardless of size, could be eligible for this funding if they are implementing the contamination reduction programming. Fourth, a local government that committed to a new or expanded recycling opportunities during the 2023 DEQ Needs Assessment Survey is eligible for either funding in advance or funding as reimbursement. Recycling service expansion identified in the needs assessment will be paid by the PRO. This applies to all local governments that participated in the needs assessment, regardless of the city's size. Eligible costs include for en-route programs, startup costs, including but not limited to trucks, containers, promotional literature, and if necessary, and none other is available, a recycling reload facility for reloading recyclables, including any compaction or baling equipment necessary for the recycling reload facility, and for recycling depots, containers, on-site monitoring equipment, site preparation, or other startup costs, and operational costs, including staffing. As Talisha noted earlier, Circular Action Alliance will be reaching out to local governments or their authorized service providers to determine the requested services. Lastly, the cost of complying with ORS 459A.908, which requires local governments to purchase new collection containers with a 10% post-consumer recycled content, will be covered. This will only be for the cost difference if the use of post-consumer materials is more expensive than the lowest priced alternative. Next, let's talk about the authorization process, what it is, and how it will work. The RMA allows a local government to authorize a service provider or other entity to receive PRO funding in advance or funding as reimbursement directly on behalf of the local government. A local government that would like to authorize a service provider or other entity to receive PRO funding on its behalf must make that authorization to DEQ. A local government may choose to make this authorization for all eligible funding types that we just discussed, or only for some of the eligible funding types, or for none at all. That means a local government has the option to retain all funding from the PRO to implement new recycling requirements or a program expansion. DEQ has created a funding authorization form and informational fact sheet for local governments. This funding authorization packet will be sent to all local governments with the opportunity to recycle reports in December 2024. Communities that are below 4,000 population but requested recycling services through a needs assessment will also receive the funding authorization packet at this time. The authorization forms are due back to DEQ in spring 2025. Start making decisions about whether your local government would like to make authorization now, as this process may require meetings with City Council or city boards or getting other types of approvals, which could take some time. The regional staff in this video are here to help you with questions on the funding mechanisms and completing the authorization form. However, DEQ will not be part of contract negotiations between the local government or the service provider and the pro. DEQ offers local governments some information to consider for the funding authorization process. First, a local government can authorize a portion of funds or the entire amount from the pro to one or more service providers or other entities, or the local government can retain all the pro funding. Next, the local governments will have an opportunity to change their funding authorization annually. If the local government authorizes all pro funding this year, they will need to wait a year to submit a new funding authorization. The authorization process could take a few months to complete, with potential city council or county board approvals, delays in obtaining necessary signatures, or other delays, so plan now. One last thing to consider is that for the purpose of these rules and pro funding caps related to population, that population is based on Portland State University's most recent estimates. And now I am happy to introduce you to Stephen Chang from DEQ's Northwest region, who will show you how to fill out the funding authorization form.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Stephen Chang, and I am the DEQ Northwest Region RMA Technical Assistant. And today, I'm going to walk you through how to use the Local Government Funding Authorization Form. This form was created to help local governments identify service providers and/or other entities that are eligible to receive PRO funding on behalf of their local government. Before we start, here are a few general instructions for using this Microsoft Excel-based form. To navigate between the different pages, click on the tabs at the bottom of the window. To zoom in and out, use the scroll bar in the bottom right of the window. Green boxes are fillable. To print, click on File, then Print to print your form. You can either print your form as a hard copy or save it as a PDF. Moving on to filling out the funding authorization form. The DEQ Local Government Funding Authorization Form consists of 3 parts, each essential to authorizing the distribution of PRO funds. I will begin with an overview of how all 3 forms relate and who is responsible for completing each form. The first form is completed and signed by the local government. The second form is completed by the local government in consultation with service providers or other entities. The third form is sent to service providers or other entities for signature and are returned to the local government. Send all 3 forms back to the DEQ completed and signed. The DEQ will not consider forms that are not signed to be complete. We will begin with the first form. The Local Government Funding Authorization Form specifies if your local government intends to authorize at least one service provider or other entity to receive PRO funding on your behalf. On the first page, first enter your local government and authorized contact person's information. By statute, the PRO is required to inform a local government anytime a payment is made to an authorized recipient on their behalf. Determine the appropriate contact person to receive this notification from the PRO. Next, read question 3 and the authorization instructions carefully. Full authorization means you are authorizing one or more service providers and/or other entities to receive all eligible compensation in that funding category directly from a PRO on behalf of your local government, and your local government will not retain any eligible compensation in that funding category. Partial authorization means you are authorizing one or more service providers and/or other entities to receive some of the compensation in that funding category directly from a PRO on behalf of your local government, and your local government will retain some of the eligible compensation in that funding category and will be responsible for distributing funding to any other entities incurring eligible costs. No authorization means your local government is retaining all eligible compensation in that funding category. and will be responsible for distributing funding to any other entities incurring eligible costs. On the reverse side of the first form, select one funding authorization from the drop-down menu for each of the 5 funding categories. In the table below, you will enter the information of service providers and/or other entities that you intend to authorize to receive PRO funding on behalf of the local government. Enter the registered business name, the applicable service area or areas, and the contact information for each of the service providers or other entities. Use additional pages as necessary. Additional pages are found on tab 1A. Finally, read the disclaimer carefully, then have your authorized local government official sign and date the form. If you do not wish to authorize any funding, select No Authorization for all 5 categories. Then, have your authorized local government official sign and date the form. If you are not authorizing any funding, you do not need to complete the remaining 2 forms. Send this form back to the DEQ. We'll now cover the second form. On the second form, you will find 5 tables corresponding to the 5 funding categories. On this form, you will specify which service providers or other entities are authorized to receive each of the 5 funding categories. In the leftmost column of each table, select a service provider or other entity from the drop-down menu that you intend to authorize to receive that funding category. Available options are based on the information entered on tab 1. You may choose to include notes to clarify expectations, responsibilities, or other contextual information. These notes are optional. These steps for each of the 5 funding categories. Use additional pages as necessary. Additional pages are found on tab 2A. We will now discuss the third form, the service provider or other entity form. This form will be used to create individual forms for each service provider for their review and signature. In the first box, select each service provider or other entity using the drop-down menu. The options are based on the selections made on tab 1. Once you have selected an authorized service provider or other entity from the drop-down menu, their respective authorizations and authorization notes will populate below. Take a moment to ensure that these authorizations are correct. You will create one form per service provider or other entity. Print and save each form to PDF and send it to the appropriate service provider or other entity for their review and signature. Service providers and other entities are encouraged to read and understand the disclaimer before signing the form. Each service provider or other entity must sign and return the form to their local government. Once you have completed all 3 forms, ensure that any additional pages you have used are attached as well. Send all forms to the DEQ for approval. Now completed your DEQ Local Government Funding Authorization Form. Now let's go back to Kathy to wrap things up.
Great. Thank you, Talisha, Rachel, and Stephen. Thank you all for listening into our presentation. We know that we've given you a lot of information and that you will likely have questions. This is a list of the RMATAs and the counties they cover. Please reach out to your regional RMATA with questions about the funding authorization process or to set up a meeting. To stay informed and receive the most up-to-date information about the RMA, we encourage you to sign up for the RMA newsletter through DEQ's GovDelivery service. Our regional specialists and RMATA teams will be sending local governments and service providers updated information throughout RMA planning and implementation, so be on the lookout for those communications. We look forward to working with you in the future.